What if I told you that behind the screaming guitars and thunderous drums, some of heavy metal's biggest icons were slowly destroying themselves one cigarette at a time? These weren't just casual smokers, they were chain smokers, puffing their way through packs like it was part of the lifestyle. The same lungs that once delivered earth-shaking vocals and relentless energy on stage were being poisoned day after day. These are the worst chain smokers in heavy metal history. Peter Steele, Type O negative. Peter Steele, the towering frontman of Type O negative, was as unforgettable for his deep, haunting voice as he was for his chain-smoking habit. Standing at 6'8", with long black hair and a brooding presence, Peter looked like he had walked straight out of a Gothic novel. But behind the powerful image was a man who lit cigarette after cigarette, rarely going without one. His bandmates and fans often spoke about how cigarettes were a permanent fixture in his life, whether he was in the studio, hanging out backstage, or even giving interviews. The smoke became part of his persona, wrapping around him like a shadow on stage. It added to the mysterious, dark aura that defined his music and his character. However, as with many musicians from the heavy metal and Gothic scenes, Peter's smoking came at a high cost. Combined with substance abuse and health issues, the constant strain of smoking wore down his body over the years. When he passed away in 2010, at just 48 years old, fans were devastated. His early death was another grim reminder of how destructive the rock and roll lifestyle could be. Even in death, Peter Steele remains a cult figure. His baritone voice, towering figure, and yes, his ever-present cigarettes remain etched in the memory of those who followed him. He embodied the Gothic metal image, with smoke swirling around him as though it was part of his being. For fans, Peter's music lives on, but so does the memory of his relentless smoking. Gene Simmons, Kiss. Gene Simmons, the fire-breathing, tongue-wagging bassist of Kiss, was the definition of excess in rock music. Though the band maintained an image that was often seen as family-friendly with their no drugs and no smoking stance, Gene himself was a different story behind the scenes. Despite the band's outward messaging, Simmons developed a chain-smoking habit that became a hidden part of his life. Known for his massive ego and sharp business sense, Gene was also known among those close to him for constantly lighting up. For a man who spent decades breathing fire on stage, it was ironic that he also filled his lungs with smoke off it. He may not have flaunted his smoking habit as openly as other heavy metal stars, but those who worked with him knew it was always there. Cigarettes became part of his downtime, a way to cope with the chaos of fame, constant touring, and the non-stop demands of being part of one of the world's biggest rock bands. While Gene's public persona focused on women, money, and fame, his private smoking habit was another chapter of indulgence. Though not as widely documented in photos or performances as other chain smokers in heavy metal history, his dependence on cigarettes was no less severe. It showed that even those who claimed to live above the vices of rock and roll were often pulled into them behind closed doors. For Simmons, the contradiction only added to his reputation as a man of excess, both celebrated and criticized in equal measure. Phil Anselmo, Pantera, Down. Phil Anselmo, the volatile frontman of Pantera and later Down, built his reputation on raw aggression and powerful stage presence. But along with the growls, shouts, and unforgettable live energy came a deep connection to cigarettes. Phil was rarely seen without one in his hand, often lighting up backstage, during interviews, and sometimes even during rehearsals. Smoking wasn't just a casual habit for him, it was a constant rhythm of his life, like a ritual before going on stage. Fans remember him as the kind of rock star who lived hard and unapologetically, and the trail of smoke became part of that image. In the 90s, when Pantera ruled the metal scene with their crushing sound, Phil's voice became one of the most recognized in heavy metal. But the harshness of chain smoking added strain to his vocal cords, a fact that became more noticeable as the years went on. Combined with substance abuse, health scares, and surgeries, cigarettes only added fuel to the fire of his personal struggles. Even in more recent years, with Anselmo attempting to rebuild his life and career, the stories of his smoking remain deeply tied to his rock persona. The tough, unapologetic leader of one of the heaviest bands of all time was also one of the heaviest smokers, a fact that etched itself into the memories of those who saw him in his prime. Phil Anselmo will always be remembered for his brutal vocals and commanding stage presence, but also for the constant haze of cigarette smoke that surrounded him. Nikki Sixx, Mötley Crüe. When it comes to embodying the wild excess of the 80s, few musicians did it like Nikki Sixx. As bassist and main songwriter of Mötley Crüe, Sixx lived fast, played hard, and nearly lost his life multiple times to drugs and reckless behavior. Cigarettes were just another vice in a long list of addictions that defined his life for decades. For Nikki, chain smoking was as natural as picking up his bass. Fans and crew members often saw him chain smoking one cigarette after another, sometimes barely letting one burn out before lighting the next. In the over-the-top world of Mötley Crüe, where debauchery was practically a lifestyle brand, smoking was just part of the chaos. Nikki often carried his cigarettes as casually as he carried his eyeliner, cementing it as part of his image. But the toll it took was real. His battles with heroin overdoses overshadowed his smoking habit, but the damage from tobacco still left its mark. Years of inhaling smoke affected his stamina and health, just as it had countless other musicians of his era. Despite his near-death experiences and eventual turnaround, Nikki Sixx's story can't be told without acknowledging how much smoking was intertwined with his life. He survived when many thought he wouldn't, but the image of him with a cigarette, dark shades, and a leather jacket remains burned into rock and roll memory. Nikki Sixx was excess personified, and his chain-smoking habit was just one more chapter in his chaotic story. Axl Rose, Guns N' Roses. Axl Rose, the fiery voice of Guns N' Roses, spent much of his career with a cigarette between his fingers. During the peak of Guns N' Roses' fame in the late 80s and early 90s, Axl was constantly photographed smoking backstage, on stage, and even during recording sessions. His signature raspy voice, both praised and criticized, was fueled in part by his non-stop smoking. For fans, cigarettes became as much a part of his image as his bandana, leather jackets, and wild performances. The habit wasn't just casual. Those who worked closely with Axl described him as a relentless smoker, often chain-smoking through stressful recording sessions or before major concerts. For a frontman whose career depended on his voice, it was a destructive pattern that only worsened as the years went on. Combined with his unpredictable behavior and clashes with bandmates, Axl's smoking was another sign of his refusal to follow rules or care about consequences. Even in more recent years, though Axl has attempted to refine his health, the stories of his heavy smoking linger. Fans who saw him in his prime still remember the haze of smoke that seemed to follow him everywhere. Cigarettes were both a comfort and a symbol of rebellion for Axl Rose, the man who gave the world "Welcome to the Jungle" and lived like he never wanted to leave it. His chain-smoking remains a lasting part of his larger-than-life rock persona. Rob Halford, Judas Priest. Rob Halford, the iconic metal god and frontman of Judas Priest, has always been known for his powerful operatic voice and commanding stage presence. But during the height of his career, Rob was also known for a different kind of constant performance, the endless ritual of smoking. Fans and insiders recall Halford puffing away before shows, in between interviews, and even after explosive live performances where his voice had carried stadiums of screaming fans. For years, cigarettes were a daily companion, one that came dangerously close to threatening his greatest gift, his voice. Halford's soaring vocals defined a generation of heavy metal, but they were constantly under strain from the wear and tear of smoking. The deep breaths required to deliver his signature high notes were harder to sustain, and the rasp in his tone only grew more pronounced over time. While fans loved the grit it added to his sound, the truth was that smoking was gradually weakening the very instrument that made him a legend. Eventually, Rob realized the habit was unsustainable. He decided to leave cigarettes behind and reinvent his lifestyle. His quitting wasn't just about health, it was also about preserving the voice that shaped Judas Priest's legacy. Even though he overcame the addiction, the memory of his smoking days remains deeply tied to his rock and roll image. For many fans, the picture of Rob Halford in leather, microphone in one hand and cigarette in the other, is just as iconic as his music itself. Tony Iommi, Black Sabbath. Tony Iommi, the riffmaster behind Black Sabbath, shaped the entire sound of heavy metal with his guitar. But while his riffs became legendary, his smoking habit became equally notorious. For decades, Iommi was rarely seen without a cigarette. In the studio, backstage, or just hanging out, he kept a steady stream of smoke surrounding him. For someone already battling health challenges, smoking only worsened his situation. Fans were shocked when Tony revealed his cancer diagnosis years later. Though he fought bravely and continued to perform with Sabbath, the reality was that years of smoking had taken a heavy toll on his body. His diagnosis served as a wake-up call, not just for him but for many fans who grew up idolizing him. Yet, through it all, Tony continued to create music, showing resilience that few could match. The image of Iommi with his cigarette became part of the mythology of Black Sabbath's darker aesthetic. The smoldering ash seemed to match the ominous riffs he created, adding to his mystique as the man who practically invented heavy metal's sound. Even though he later sought treatment and fought to recover, his chain-smoking days left scars that couldn't be erased. Fans still celebrate his unmatched creativity, but they also recognize how cigarettes nearly robbed the world of his genius. Tony Iommi remains both an icon of survival and one of heavy metal's most infamous smokers. Dave Mustaine, Megadeth. Dave Mustaine, the fiery founder of Megadeth and former Metallica guitarist, carried a reputation for arrogance, brilliance, and relentless determination. But just as relentless was his smoking habit. For years, Mustaine was almost inseparable from cigarettes, often spotted chain-smoking during interviews, rehearsals, and even in the studio while working on Megadeth's intricate thrash anthems. For someone whose voice had to cut through aggressive guitars and pounding drums, smoking was a constant enemy. His raspy growl became part of his identity, but it also reflected the damage his vocal cords endured from decades of inhaling smoke. Bandmates and fans often commented on how much he smoked, sometimes barely finishing one cigarette before lighting another. Smoking seemed to mirror his personality, intense, obsessive, and destructive at times. As the years went on, Mustaine faced serious health issues, including a throat cancer diagnosis. Though he fought hard and survived, the link between his smoking and his health struggles was impossible to ignore. For fans, the sight of Mustaine with a cigarette in hand became a familiar part of his legend, but it also carried a grim reminder of the risks tied to the lifestyle. Despite it all, Dave's legacy as one of thrash metal's greatest minds remains intact. His riffs and songwriting changed the genre forever, even as his smoking habit nearly cut that legacy short. He stands as one of the clearest examples of how heavy metal's chain-smoking culture left lasting scars on its greatest icons. Slash Guns N' Roses, Velvet Revolver. Few images in rock history are as iconic as Slash on stage, top hat tilted low, cigarette hanging from his lips, guitar wailing with effortless brilliance. For decades, the Guns N' Roses guitarist practically turned smoking into part of his stage act. Whether performing in massive arenas or recording in the studio, Slash often played entire solos with a cigarette dangling from his mouth, the smoke swirling around him like part of the show. It wasn't just an accessory, it was a near-permanent fixture. His chain-smoking reached legendary levels. Friends and bandmates spoke about how Slash would go through pack after pack without pause, sometimes lighting one cigarette with the dying ember of another. It became as recognizable as his Les Paul guitar, part of the mystique that made him one of rock's most beloved guitar heroes. But behind the cool image was a habit that came with consequences. Years of smoking, combined with heavy drinking and drug use, took a severe toll on his health. Slash suffered heart problems and underwent major surgery, forcing him to face the reality of his lifestyle. Though he eventually made serious lifestyle changes, his smoking habit was one of the most destructive parts of his rock and roll excess. Fans still picture him in that iconic pose, smoke rising, guitar screaming. But they also know that his survival was a narrow escape. Slash's chain-smoking is legendary, but so is his resilience in overcoming it and continuing to inspire generations of musicians. They may have lived like rock gods, but even legends couldn't escape the grip of nicotine. The same smoke that fueled their image ended up stealing their strength, their voices, and in some cases, their lives. So, which story shocked you the most, the star who lost their voice or the one who lost it all? If you want more untold truths from the darker side of heavy metal, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because the next story might just blow your mind.